Chapter 24, The New Deal. As we spoke about in the last chapter, America is in the depths of the Great Depression. The affluence and prosperity of the 1920s did not continue under Hoover's administration. And as we move into 1932, we have reached the nadir. We have reached the lowest point of the Great Depression. And as it so happens, 1932 is also a presidential election year. So everybody knew that a change was coming, right? The Republicans had been in power virtually since the end of the Civil War, with only a couple of exceptions. And now people are tired. They're scared. They blame the Republican Party for the Great Depression, whether or not it was truly something they could control. So everybody knew that a change was coming in 1932. Although I don't know if we ever could have predicted just how massive a change it was going to be. So that's what we're going to talk about in this chapter. Broad themes of the Great Depression. We're going to talk about the New Deal, how it came about, why it came about, what it was supposed to do. We're going to talk about the critics of FDR and why a lot of people had problems with him. And then lastly, we are going to look at the legacy of the New Deal. Did it work? Did it do what it was supposed to do? Okay, let's talk about the 100 Days. This dashing young fellow is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who will be elected to the office of president in 1932. You might recognize the name. FDR is, in fact, a distant cousin of Teddy Roosevelt. As a matter of fact, they were fifth cousins, and as it so happens, just as an aside, FDR's wife, Eleanor, was a Roosevelt before she got married. Teddy was actually her uncle. So, okay, fine, whatever. FDR is a distant cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, and he loved Teddy Roosevelt, okay? He was his famous big cousin, and FDR idolized Teddy Roosevelt and wanted to be just like him. So Teddy Roosevelt served in the New York state legislature, so did FDR. Teddy Roosevelt served as Assistant Secretary to the Navy, so did FDR. Teddy Roosevelt served as Governor of New York, so did FDR. Teddy Roosevelt ran for president, so did FDR. He very closely follows the political path laid down by his at that time, his more famous cousin. Now, there's something you need to understand about FDR and about the Roosevelts in general. As you might figure, with two presidents in the family, they are a very wealthy, powerful family of New York. Okay, FDR had an extremely privileged upbringing. He went to the best schools. He received the best education. He wanted for nothing that money could buy. Okay, the Roosevelts, we don't have aristocrats in the United States, right? We don't have nobility, but the Roosevelts were probably as close as it ever came. They were wealthy. They were established. They were a very politically powerful family. And the reason I'm telling you all of this is because it's kind of hard to understand that in 1932, at the depth of the Great Depression, 25% of the people are unemployed. People cannot put food on the table for their families. It's the lowest of the low. People are as worse off as they have ever been. And here comes FDR, who, as I said, never wanted for anything in his life. Even at the depth of the Great Depression, he was not close to going hungry. Here comes FDR saying, elect me as president and I will lead you out of it. And the people's response, they loved FDR. And it's hard to overstate this. People loved FDR. They saw him as one of their own. And the people identified with him. Even, as I said, you could have been out of work for years. You could have been the poorest dirt farmer coming out of Oklahoma looking for the promised land in California. And yet, when you heard FDR or you saw him in the newspaper, you thought, he's looking out for me. He's got my best interest at heart. I've heard numerous stories. People would walk in to someone's house, and they go into the living room, and there would be two pictures up on the mantelpiece. There would be a picture of Jesus, and there would be a picture of FDR right next to it. That's the kind of, that's how people thought of him in the Great Depression. And part of it was that the Roosevelts, they were established. They were not a member of the nouveau riche. They were not the new rich that were largely blamed for the Great Depression. You know, that they weren't a byproduct of the Roaring Twenties. And the other thing is that he had a very paternalistic view. He was a father figure. People thought that FDR, yes, he might be wealthy, and yes, he might be educated, and yes, he might be of the patrician class, but he was looking out for me. It was a father figure that, yes, that person is more powerful and wealthier than I am, but he's not set against me. He's here to help me out. So again, he was beloved by his people. His fireside chats were radio addresses directed not at other politicians. They were directed at the common people. And they were known as the fireside chats because it was like you were sitting in front of the fire with an old friend having a discussion. So that's how he got his message out to the people. And like I said, he was beloved. Of course he was. He was elected to president 4 times. That's never happened before, and it can't ever happen again because after him they changed the law, right? So I can't overstate it enough. The way that most people, not everybody, but the way that most people in the United States felt about Franklin Roosevelt. Okay. As I've mentioned previously, the Great Depression is a worldwide phenomenon, right? It's not something that's just in the United States. It starts in the United States, and because at that point our economy was so large and dominated the globe, anything that happened in the United States would have a worldwide effect, and it did. As a matter of fact, it starts in the United States, but we're not the worst off country. We are the second hardest hit in the Great Depression, the global depression. The hardest hit country is actually going to be Germany. And so responses to the Great Depression are going to vary all over the world. You have everything from Joseph Stalin coming to power in the Soviet Union to Adolf Hitler in Germany. And so it makes, it's easier to understand how does someone like Hitler take power in a country like Germany? Well, they were worse off than we were, okay? So lots of different responses. People went in all different directions. Now, for his part, Franklin Roosevelt talked about a New Deal, and he used this even before he became president. As he was running for president during his campaign, he always spoke about a New Deal. Now, what was the New Deal? He doesn't know. He doesn't have any specifics. He doesn't have a clue what he's going to do when he becomes president. The difference was, the message was, I'm going to do something. You look at the Republicans over the past decade, and remember that their mantra was government should stay out of, government should stay out of business. Government should do nothing. And here comes FDR who says, I understand you're hurting, and I'm going to do something. I don't know what it is yet. It may work, it may not, but I'm willing to try to do something. Now, FDR had what he called his brain trust. They're the people he relied on to come up with the ideas behind the New Deal. Francis Perkins, Harry Hopkins, Harold Ickes, Louis Brandeis. These were his brain trust. These were his idea men and women. And again, they really didn't know what they were doing when they came into power, but they knew they were going to do something. And what they realized, what they came up with, the thought behind the New Deal is that the competitive market was over. This free market economy that had been run under the Republican administrations, that was done. That was no longer working. Now, these large firms don't have to be dismantled. We're not going to come in and take everything over. We're not going to come in and have government takeover, but they do need to be managed. They do need to be directed. And that's another similarity between FDR and Teddy Roosevelt. If you remember back when we spoke about Teddy Roosevelt, a lot of people branded him as a radical, this wild-eyed man who was willing to do anything, and that wasn't true. Teddy Roosevelt truly was a moderate, and FDR was the same way. A lot of people wanted to paint him as a radical, that he was coming in and doing these communist, socialist, far to the left ideas, and that's not true. Maybe he was much more liberal than anyone who had come before, but I think FDR realized the sort of situation that the United States was in. He realized that it would be easy for the government to be overthrown, that the people were unhappy, the people were out of work, they couldn't put food on the table. there was a lot of tension in the United States. And so it would have been easy. We saw it happen in Germany, right? Adolf Hitler rose to power. It would have been easy for someone like Hitler to come to power in the United States, and he didn't want that. So he pushed for moderate change to prevent radical change. He knew there had to be some sort of change, that things could not continue as they had for the past 12 years. There had to be some sort of change. So he pushed for moderate change to prevent radical change. And the New Deal they came up with focused on the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief, to help people survive; recovery, to fix the economy; and reform, to make changes to prevent another Great Depression from happening in the future. The first thing he has to deal with is the banking crisis. And this is immediately, this is just, literally hours after he becomes president. Remember that the financial system in the United States is on the verge of collapse, right? We spoke about all those banking runs, the weak independent banking system that we had. The first thing that he did was declare a so-called bank holiday. He closed all banks in the United States for 4 days. He calls Congress into special session and passed what's known as the Emergency Banking Act. The Emergency Banking Act did a couple of things. The first thing it did, it protected large banks from failing from the small ones. What happened was the Treasury Department, while the banks were closed, the Treasury Department would go in and inspect the bank. Remember, some of these banks are failing that were perfectly sound financial institutions. It's just that when you saw your neighbor lose all his money in his bank, you're going to want to go and take all the money out of your bank as well, even if it's not showing any signs of problem. So the Treasury Department went in, inspected all the banks, and the ones that were okay were allowed to reopen. 75% of all banks were allowed to reopen. And the thing about it was, it restored people's faith, because they said, look, the government has inspected it, the government has checked the books, the government says it's okay, I'm going to leave my money there. It stops all these banking runs and the collapse of the financial institution of the United States. It also passed what was known as the Glass-Stegall Act, which regulated banks in the buying and selling of stocks. This was important because most of the banks that were in trouble had heavily invested in stock, and when the stock market crashed, it took those banks out. It also created the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Every time you see a banking commercial on the TV, or when you do business at your bank, it always has that little sticker, member FDIC. What that says is that if the bank goes under for whatever reason, if the bank goes under and you've got money in the bank, the government will pay you what you had. And it's up to a certain limit. It used to be $125,000 during the Great Recession, back in 2008, 2009. They doubled that to $250,000. But regardless, up to that limit, if you've got, say, a checking account with $25,000 in the bank goes under, you lose your money, the government will come in and give you your money back. So again, they're restoring people's faith in the banking system, and it works. It saves the banking industry in the United States. It also greatly increases government regulation and control of banks through the Glass-Stegall Act, through some of these regulatory agencies we're going to talk about in a second. Well, this was the first action of the so-called 100 days. The first 3 months of FDR's administration. And this becomes a thing. Even today, for example, we'll elect a new president in November. Even today, a new president is judged by his or her 100 days. The first 3 months in office, what can you get done? Franklin Roosevelt got all this stuff done. What did you get done in your 100 days? Well, in Franklin's 100 days, commonly referred to as the alphabet soup agencies. And the reason they're known as the alphabet soup agencies is you see all the acronyms, the CCC, the AAA, the PWA, the NIRA, the WPA, the TVA. There's all these acronyms, and you won't have to remember all of them. But we are going to go over the bigger ones. So, for example, the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which created the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. Remember that farmers are hurting during the Great Depression. Part of it was due to the increasing mechanization. We didn't need as many farmers. You could produce more food with fewer farmers. A lot of it had to do with overproduction. A lot of it had to do with the Dust Bowl. So FDR knows he has to do something to help out the farmers. So he comes up with the AAA. And what the AAA did was, it was designed to stop crop production to end surpluses. Remember, that was the biggest problem that farmers had, is that even with the Dust Bowl, with the use of fertilizers, with the use of mechanization, combines and tractors and things of that nature, they're still producing too much food. And so when supply outstrips demand, that's going to drive prices down. Well, essentially what the AAA did was, it went in and paid farmers not to grow crops. It went in and paid farmers not to raise livestock. And by doing that, you suppress supply, and therefore demand is going to go up. Pretty good deal for the farmers. You're essentially getting paid to do nothing. And there's a couple of problems with this, though. Number one was the image of farmers burning their crops while people are going hungry in the United States. That struck a lot of people as not so smart. The other thing it did, the AAA overwhelmingly supported larger farms. So these huge, 10,000 acre plus outfits in the Midwest, those are the ones that received the vast majority of the subsidies. It didn't do a whole lot for the small farmer, and it actively hurt sharecroppers, because think about this. Let's say you're the landowner, and the landowner is the one who's going to be receiving the check because they're the ones that own the land. And you have a sharecropping family on your land, and the deal you have with them is they raise crops on your land, and in return for letting them use your land, they pay you a share of the crop. That's what sharecropping is, right? They're paying with a share of their crop as rent money. Well, now all of a sudden you're getting a check from the government not to grow crops on that land. So you don't need the sharecropper anymore. So a lot of sharecroppers are going to be kicked off of their farms. So it really favors the large farms, doesn't do a lot for the small farmer, and more than that, it actively hurts sharecroppers who were already the bottom rung of society anyway, right? They're already among the poorest members of society, so this did nothing for them. It actually hurt them. Another thing that he accomplished during his 100 days was the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. And this was something, remember, that Hoover absolutely refused to do, and that was to give out direct cash payments to citizens. It was like food stamps or a welfare check, or it was a check in the mail from the government, so you could go out and buy groceries, so you could pay the mortgage on your house, so you wouldn't lose it. Remember that Hoover was very afraid that once he started doing this, people would come to expect it, and he would never be able to stop it. But FDR realized the situation was so dire, he had to do something. So he did begin direct cash payments to people through the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. However, that was a last-ditch effort. That was an effort of last resort, okay? He much preferred to create jobs through programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was a pseudo-military organization that young men joined. And, for example, they did work in the National Park Service. In fact, a lot of the national parks today, the older sections of it, you can look and see, a stone-laden foundation that says CCC 1933 or 34, whenever it happened to be built. It was as I mentioned, it was a pseudo-military organization. The young men went, they lived in barracks, they wore uniforms, and the great thing about it was all of their needs were taken care of. They had shelter, they had clothing, they had food provided to them. So all the money they made, they could send back to their families. And in fact, it was a stipulation that they had to send so much of their paycheck back home to their families. You have the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was it built dams that did a number of things throughout the Tennessee River Valley. For example, the dams, they provide flood control, right? But there were also hydroelectric power generators. And so it brought electricity to thousands of families that did not have electricity before. They were huge construction projects that put people to work. They created lakes, which boosted tourism, and they controlled flooding, which made it easier to ship goods up and down the river. all of these new families, all these families that have electricity for the first time, they need appliances to run off this electricity. So they go out and they buy, washing machines and vacuum cleaners and whatever else. So it was a huge boost to the economy of that region. And more than that, it also gave the federal government a yardstick. They could say, look, we know exactly how much it costs to produce electricity, so we know exactly how much you should be charging for it. And so it was another regulatory agency where the government could go into power utilities and say, look, you're charging too much. We know exactly what it costs, so we get to tell you now. So, okay. Probably one of the biggest work agencies is the PWA, the Public Works Administration. You can see here that they always put up big signs advertising this was a project paid for by the PWA. They built schools, they built roads, they built hospitals. They did a lot of the infrastructure building in the United States during the 1930s. Probably the centerpiece, however, of the New Deal was known as the National Industrial Recovery Act, which created the National Recovery Administration, the NRA. So if you hear me say NRA in this presentation, I'm not referring to the National Rifle Association. I'm talking about the National Recovery Administration. The National Industrial Recovery Act was modeled on the highly successful War Industries Board of World War I. Remember when we were talking about the economy during World War I? The government had a lot of say-so in the economy. It was a planned economy. Remember, the government went in and said, you used to make cars, now you make military vehicles. You used to make women's clothing, now you make uniforms for the soldiers. You used to produce food for civilians, now you're producing food for soldiers. It was that kind of thinking. It did not go in to take over the economy. Remember, the whole idea between the War Industries Board and business was that it was a partnership. And that's the same way that the NRA saw itself. It was a partnership between business and government for the benefit of both. So they did things like they set minimum wage, which at the time was between 30 and 40 cents an hour. They set a work week of around 35 to 40 hours. They got rid of child labor. They also established what they called floors. Part of the problem with the economy during this time, it was a rush to the bottom. Let's say that you're a car manufacturer and you're sitting on excess inventory, and we spoke about Say's law in last chapter. You've got 100 cars that you're trying to sell for $100 a piece, and then you see your competitor is selling his cars for $90 a piece. Well, you're thinking, well, I don't want to lose money on my inventory, but I got to sell my cars. Something is better than nothing, right? So he's selling his for 90. I'm going to sell mine for 80. And your competitor sees that and he drops his to 70. And it's a race to the bottom. And the problem is, by the time you get to the bottom, you're selling all your stuff, but you're not making any money. So they established these floors. Floors they were the limit to what a producer could sell his goods for. So it's almost price fixing, right? But it's legal since the government's doing it. The competitors would get together and say, okay, we're going to set our floor at $75 a car. And we both agree not to sell it for anything less than that. Okay. One of the major pieces of the NIRA was what was known as Section 7A, and that literally refers to Section 7, subsection A of the National Industrial Recovery Act, which said that if you wanted to be part of the NRA, you must recognize labor unions. And this was a big deal. It was known as the Blue Eagle. The symbol of the NRA was the Blue Eagle. And so if you wanted to show people that you were doing your patriotic duty, if you wanted to show people that you were behind the American government, and of course everybody did, right? Because they wanted the customers to know that they were working in their favor, so they would buy stuff from their store. It's just like, you put a flag on it, made in America, so people will buy it. Everybody wanted the Blue Eagle in their window. So everybody agreed, yes, we will recognize the right of labor unions to exist. However, like the AAA, the NIRA had problems as well. The NIRA was complex. It's hard to understand. It's not especially well written. Just like the AAA, it benefits large manufacturers more than small manufacturers. And Section 7A, it doesn't have any enforcement clause. It says you must recognize labor unions, but it can't do anything to you if you don't. So people could say, yes, we absolutely will, and then just ignore it and nothing would happen. So it has problems as well. Other notable 100 Days legislation, the repeal of Prohibition. That was a big one. This was one of the things that FDR had actively campaigned on. He said, you make me president, I'm going to get rid of Prohibition. Remember, Prohibition was the outlaw of manufacture, use, and sale of alcohol within the United States. It was a dismal failure. It did not stop people from manufacturing, consuming, and selling alcohol within the United States. And it gave rise to, the modern day mob, among other things. So it was a huge, huge disaster. And so he got rid of Prohibition, or, he signed the amendment that got rid of Prohibition. He wasn't the only one. It created the Securities and Exchange Commission, which was a stock market watchdog regulatory agency. It created the Federal Communications Division, which was a watchdog on what went out over the airwaves. So as you can see, a big deal. A lot of the New Deal programs, you had relief, which was helping people get a job or put food back on the table. It was recovery, things to try and jumpstart the economy. And it was reform, putting in these government regulatory agencies to prevent another Great Depression from ever happening again. And once more, it's a series of experiments. Some of them work, some of them don't. FDR comes into office not really knowing what to do. All he knows is that he's willing to do something. And so they're throwing stuff up and seeing what sticks. It does not end the Great Depression. I want you to remember that, and I'm going to ask you that on the test. I can guarantee you. Did the New Deal end the Great Depression? No, it absolutely did not. But it did give people hope, okay? For years and years, stock market crashed in 29, we hit the bottom in 1932. For years and years, people had felt like there was no hope. There was nobody looking out for them. The state governments are exhausted. Private charities are exhausted. Everybody's in the same boat. Nothing's being done. People didn't see any end in sight. And now, FDR has come along, and at least he's given them a reason to live, right? He's helping keep a roof over their heads. He's helping put food on the table. And you can see why they would put his picture up on the mantelpiece right beside Jesus, right? And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but I also want to say that FDR got a lot of credit for this himself personally, and that was something different about the United States. This is something that hadn't happened in America before. People were divorced from the federal government. The federal government didn't have a lot of impact on their life, and now all of a sudden, yes, the federal government is very active in your life, and we'll talk about that, but that's something you definitely need to be aware of. All right, let's talk about this revolt against FDR. Because as I mentioned, not everybody is his biggest fan. His arch nemesis, if you will, is the Supreme Court. Most of the Supreme Court justices, in fact, probably all of them at this point, I'd have to go back and double check, but the majority of Supreme Court justices have been appointed by Republican presidents. And the Republican presidents that said the government ought to stay out of business, the Supreme Court felt the same way. It's a very conservative body. And as FDR's enemies bring lawsuits against the AAA and the NRA, it's just like Obamacare today, right? Obamacare is a very liberal program. Conservative groups from all across the country have brought lawsuits against it. The difference is that Obamacare, as of yet, has not been declared unconstitutional, but major portions of the New Deal were. In fact, both the AAA and the NIRA were declared unconstitutional, and those were the two biggest programs within the New Deal. So FDR faces major problems when the Supreme Court declares his programs unconstitutional. And the problem with it was, the reason they declared them unconstitutional, and I'm not saying it was wrong of them to do that, the NRA and the AAA both gave the president pretty broad legislative powers. And that's not supposed to happen in the United States. Congress passes the laws, the president enforces the laws. The president doesn't get to write the laws. That's not the president's job. And so since these acts, since these laws gave the presidents too much power, they were declared unconstitutional. Another thing was the Interstate Commerce Clause. Technically, under the Constitution, Congress only has the authority to regulate commerce that crosses state lines. Well, what if you raise and sell cows just within the state of Arkansas and it never crosses state lines? People were arguing that Congress didn't have the right to regulate that. And they might have been right because the Supreme Court declared the AAA unconstitutional. Okay, fine. Labor during this time is also beginning to blow up. Labor unions, now that they, for probably the first time in American history, feel like the government is actually on their side. Remember, for years and years and years, the court system in particular was directly arrayed against labor unions. Now that unions feel they have an ally in the government, their membership explodes. Membership doubles between 1930 and 1940. We see the creation of new nationwide labor unions, the most important of which is the Congress of Industrial Organizations. At this time, the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, was the largest labor union in the United States, and the CIO is actually going to emerge as kind of a competitor against it. It's a more militant organization. It's more open to minority members. And of course, it's the great irony that eventually the AFL and CIO will merge into the spectacularly unimaginative AFL-CIO that exists today. But anyway, we do see the creation of major labor organizations during this time. But back to the critics. Not everyone was a fan of the New Deal. On the one hand, poor FDR, he can't win for losing, right? Because on the one hand, people on the right, more conservative people, are saying that it's too liberal. For instance, you have the American Liberty League that says FDR is a wild-eyed radical, right? He's a communist in disguise who's come in to destroy our country. Well, people on the right thought he was too liberal. People on the left thought he was too conservative. So that should tell you more than anything that he actually was a moderate, trying to keep the middle road. If you've got critics on the right, you've got critics on the left, that should tell you you're somewhere in the middle. Now, the critics on the left were probably more visible and louder than any other critics that FDR had to face. This gentleman is Huey Long. Huey Long was a former governor, later senator from Louisiana. Incredibly corrupt, incredibly popular man. And he gained national recognition for what he called the Share Our Wealth program. And the Share Our Wealth program, it was kind of like a club. And so you would have Share Our Wealth clubs that popped up all across the country. Share Our Wealth was a popular and truly radical alternative to the New Deal. Share Our Wealth was a 100% tax rate on incomes and wealth above a certain amount. This is true income redistribution. So essentially what he said was, Huey Long, he said, look, and these are in 1930s dollars. He said, anything above $8 million that you have, the government is going to take. Just you can amass a personal fortune of $8 million. Now that's nothing to sneeze at today, and those are I don't even know how much that would be in 1930 some odd dollars. Okay, so it's not like he was leaving people broke and penniless on the side of the road. But he said any personal fortune above $8 million goes to the government. Anything over $1 million in annual income goes to the government. And by doing this, he claimed to have the figures. I think people have sat down and worked the math later on, and it doesn't work out. But Huey Long claimed that if you did this, he could guarantee a minimum income of somewhere between $2,000 and $2,500 every year for an American family. And that was a lot of money back then. That was the average median income. So that was a lot of money to people. And this really resonates with American citizens because a lot of them looked at big business who they're not hurting, okay? And in fact, big business does pretty well during the Great Depression because as people are going out of business and they're having to sell all their stuff, they're getting some really great deals on land and resources and things of that nature. So big business is not doing as badly as other people. This really resonated with people when they see, look, I'm trying to find a job, and here they are making money. They're getting wealthier during the Great Depression. So this truly was a radical alternative that a lot of people very, very much in favor of. He was a very strong competitor of FDR, and as a matter of fact, a lot of people thought that he would challenge FDR for the presidency. Didn't happen because, as I mentioned, he was corrupt, and his past is going to catch up to him. He's eventually going to be assassinated before he can challenge FDR for the presidency, but one of his most visible and vocal critics on the left. You also have people such as Father Coughlin, the so-called radio priest, who was the founder of the National Union for Social Justice. Dr. Townshend, Charles Townshend, is actually a pretty interesting idea. He came up with the idea of old age pensions, and what he wanted was, he said, and again, I think people have run the numbers, and I don't know that this would have worked out, but what he wanted was $200 a month. So you can see that 2025, that's a median income. $200 a month for every person over the age of 60 that was retired. The kicker was you would not be allowed to save that money. You had to spend all of that money during the month, or it went back to the government. And so again, the idea was you're trying to jumpstart the economy. You're trying to prime the pump by putting money back into the economy. It was the same, really the same idea that FDR had, but it was more palatable because you're helping out the elderly, right? And so that was more acceptable, I suppose. Well, partially because a lot of his plans were declared unconstitutional, partially in response to his more vocal and visible critics on the left, in 1935, FDR launches the Second New Deal. And this Second New Deal will be much more open to attacking the wealthy. I would not call it truly radical, but it is going to be more open to attacking the wealthy than the First New Deal was. So, for example, the National Labor Relations Act will be passed during this Second New Deal, more popularly known as the Wagner Act, after the senator that sponsored it. Since Section 7A was declared unconstitutional along with the rest of the NIRA, the National Labor Relations Act creates the National Labor Relations Board, which again fulfills much of the same function as Section 7A in protecting workers and labor unions, but this time there's an enforcement mechanism. The board can actually call you into court and hit you with lawsuits and do stuff to you, whereas Section 7A didn't have those teeth. We also see the creation of the modern Social Security program, and of course this was a direct answer to Townshend's old age pensions, right? The idea that the federal government, once you are retired, they will make payments to you, and of course that still exists today, although it's in jeopardy. Unemployment insurance, of course, goes along with the Social Security Act. And also the Works Progress Administration was created. This was by far the biggest work relief agency to date. And the thing that's interesting about the WPA, a lot of the, if you've noticed, if you've paid attention, a lot of the programs, the CCC, the TVA, the PWA, they're all heavy on construction, right? They're going out and creating national parks. They're going out and building dams. They're going out and building roads and bridges and schools and hospitals. The WPA also paid non-traditional workers. So, for example, they paid photographers to travel across the United States and document the Great Depression in pictures. A lot of the truly amazing photographs we have from this era came from WPA photographers. They paid playwrights to write plays about the Great Depression. They paid actors to stage these plays, right? So they put non-traditional people back to work as well. So that this comes up to the election of 1936. And at one point, a lot of people were wondering what FDR was going to do. As the New Deal programs were declared unconstitutional, as Huey Long and other critics began to mount their attacks against FDR, a lot of people were wondering, is he going to run for re-election? And if he does, is he going to win? Something I haven't mentioned about FDR yet, he was disabled, right? He grew up perfectly fine, but then as a young man, the accepted answer is that he contracted polio and left him paralyzed from the waist down. New research has questioned that. Was it polio or was it another rare type of disease? It doesn't matter. The end result was the same. FDR was paralyzed from the waist down, and no one in the United States knew about this. Think about that for a second. Now, people knew, obviously. People who saw him on a daily basis. The media knew about it. But the thing about FDR, and I'm talking by the time he ran for president, he was paralyzed. They were all willing to give him his privacy. And so there are very, very few pictures. In fact, I can just think of one or two offhand that show FDR actually sitting in a wheelchair. Most of the time, he's riding in a car. He had special leg braces constructed so that he could stand up in front of a podium. Now, he couldn't really move around a lot, but he could stand up in front of a podium and give a speech, and people would never know. So he had his health problems. And again, it's amazing. That can never happen today, right? With the media we have today, this sort of thing could not be hidden the way that it was back in the 1930s. So there are questions. But as it so happens, the election of 1936 rolls around. The economy's climbing back up. Most of his detractors have fallen by the wayside. By this point, Huey Long has been assassinated. Father Coughlin and Townshend throw their support behind some third-party candidate that doesn't do anything. And FDR is overwhelmingly reelected. And probably more than anything else, and this is important, by 1936, the Democrats have realigned themselves as a political party. Remember I said during the 1920s, the big problem that the Democratic Party had, and probably since the end of the Civil War, if we're going to be honest, was that it was not unified, right? You have all these disparate parts. You have traditional Democrats in the South, then you have urban workers in the cities, you have the small farmers out west, and you have all these different groups of people that can never really get on the same page about anything. But by the time 1936 rolls around, they have, and we see the birth of the new Democratic Party, the one that more closely resembles the Democratic Party that we have today. It is the party of small farmers, yes, but it's also the party of the working class. It's the party of immigrants. It's the party of traditional progressives. The Democratic Party has realigned and reunified after and part because of FDR. So here comes FDR. He's won re-election, a comfortable re-election. And he decides to put this to good use. He feels that he has the mandate, right? He feels that America has spoken and they approve of what he's been doing. But he's got a problem because the Supreme Court keeps declaring his programs unconstitutional. Well, he comes up with a plan. It's commonly known as the court packing plan. And so what he proposes to do is, there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court. He says, look, many of our justices are elderly. So I'm going to give them help. They've got too many cases to go over. Their caseload is too heavy. I'm going to give them help. I'm going to appoint an associate justice. So for every justice that's over the age of, I can't remember what it was, for every associate over the age of 65, I'm going to appoint an associate justice who will help them out. And then once the original justice retires, the associate justice can step into place. Excuse me. Now, he's not fooling anybody with this. Everybody knows he's trying to pack the court with liberal justices who will keep his programs running. and it blows up in his face. I mean, nothing permanent happens because of it. He just burns a lot of that goodwill and political capital that he had accumulated by winning re-election, and it doesn't go through. As it turns out, it doesn't matter because either they changed their mind, or maybe he accomplished what he wanted and scared them, because the Supreme Court stopped declaring his programs unconstitutional. So, okay, fine. By the time we get into 1937, it looks like things are headed back to where they need to be. They're almost back to 1929 levels, so we've clawed our way back to where we should be. Now, there should be a lot of growth, right? We should have added a lot of growth between 29 and 37, but at least we're back to where we were back before the economy went into a tailspin. And so FDR begins scaling back. Now, these New Deal programs, they cost a lot of money, okay? The government had gone deep into deficit spending during these years. And that worried even FDR. FDR was not crazy about the idea of spending all this money. So as soon as it looked like things were getting better, he decides to start scaling back and begin cutting funding to some of these work relief programs. And that scares the bejesus out of people, and all of a sudden the economy collapses again, almost all the way back down to 1932 levels. So it wipes out almost all of the gains that had been made. And he can't throw this one off on Hoover, right? Hoover bore the brunt of the first Great Depression, or at least the first part of it. Roosevelt bore the brunt of the blame for this one, the so-called Roosevelt recession. So he has to go back to Congress and ask for more money to keep these relief programs open. By the time we hit 1938, the New Deal is effectively over. Congress is no longer dominated by New Deal Democrats who are willing to go along with FDR. And as it turns out, and we'll talk about it in the next few chapters, things are beginning to heat up in Europe yet once again. And so FDR is going to have even more bigger fish to fry, so to speak. But let's talk about the legacy of the New Deal, because just because it's pretty much over and done with by 1938 doesn't mean the effects of the New Deal aren't still being felt today. Some of the effects, of course, are evident, right? We still have programs like Social Security that are still hanging around today. But probably more than that, the New Deal creates what's known as a broker state. Previous to the New Deal, it had been the federal government and big business. And they either worked together, or you can say government was dominated by big business, whatever you want to say. But there was just government, and government only listened to big business. After the New Deal, that's different. Now, all of a sudden, the government is a mediator, is a go-between between all these different interest groups. Yes, there's big business, but now there's labor, now there's consumers, now there are labor unions, now there's agriculture. And so it's the go-between, it's the mediator between all these different interest groups. It's no longer just the corporate world dominating politics. Now we have all these other groups that also want their time in the limelight. They want their piece of the pie. One group that's not helped are African Americans. It's not that the New Dealers are hostile to black people. In fact, Eleanor Roosevelt was a huge supporter of racial equality. Eleanor Roosevelt was a truly amazing woman. She was really the first modern first lady. When first ladies come into their office, and make no mistake, it is an office all of their own. They have their own funding, they have their own staff. They have their own mandates. Whenever a first lady comes into office today, they all have their own initiative, right? With Michelle Obama, it's healthy eating. With Laura Bush, it was reading. They all have their own program, their own agenda. Eleanor Roosevelt was really the first modern first lady in that regard, that she came in with an agenda. She is a huge supporter of racial equality and minority rights. And as a matter of fact, President Roosevelt appointed a number of African Americans to very high-level positions within his government. They referred to these people as the Black Cabinet. The problem was he's still a president in the Democratic Party, right? And the solid South, the Democratic South, was still heavily segregated, active discrimination against minorities, and so he couldn't risk losing the support of Southern Democrats by appearing to openly help black people in the United States. And so, no, the New Deal does not challenge existing discrimination. And sad to say, some of the New Deal programs even reinforce discrimination within the United States. New Deal doesn't do a whole lot for Native Americans. In fact, pretty much all the New Deal said was you need to assimilate. New Deal doesn't do a whole lot for women. And again, as with African Americans, they're not actively hostile towards women, but it simply didn't support them. And remember, it was a different time. Not that that changes things or excuses things, but the idea was that, number one, women were not traditionally seen as people who should be working outside the home. And number two, a woman that was working outside the home was seen as a woman who was taking a job from a man who was trying to provide for his family. Now, there are notable exceptions during this time. Frances Perkins was the first woman cabinet member in United States history. Hattie Caraway was the first woman elected to the United States Senate in her own right. What happened was Hattie Caraway's husband was a member of the Senate. He passed away, and it was the tradition then that when someone died in office, usually their wife served out the rest of his term. And that's exactly what happened. Her husband died in office, and she served out the rest of his term. And that had happened before. But then when the term was up, she ran for re-election under her own name, and she won. That was the first time that a woman had been elected to the United States Senate in her own right. And wonder of wonders, it came out of a southern state. As a matter of fact, it was Arkansas. She was one of the senators for Arkansas. So they're not actively hostile towards women, but they do not go out of their way to help them either. Two areas that received special attention were the South and the West. The West in particular, just because of the scale of projects, these big, huge dams, these big highways that are all being built out west, that it's just because of the scale. The West is a huge place, and if you do anything, it's got to be big. And so it was just the large scale of these projects that gave a lot of money out west. The South, of course, the South was underdeveloped to begin with. Still feeling the effects of Reconstruction and rebuilding after the Civil War. And so the South was worse off to begin with. So any help was going to be felt more in the South than it would be in any other place in the United States, but probably more than that. And this is the last thing, and this is what I really want you guys to focus on. The office of the president and the federal government at large are going to be forever changed by the Great Depression. You know, I like to talk about, there's been 3 or 4 major events that really grow the power of the presidency. George Washington, just because he was the first, Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, FDR during the Great Depression, and maybe we can start talking about George W. Bush after 9/11. But with the exception of George Washington, all 3 of those things have something in common, right? There's a crisis. There's a catastrophe. People are going to the American president and saying, we need help. We need you to do something. The first time that happened, though, was really with FDR. For the first time in American history, the American president has become the guy, or the person, has become the face of the government. And think about it today. Anytime a crisis occurs, who do we look for to leadership? Who do we look for to their opinion? We look to the president. We say, well, what has the president said about this? When is the president giving a speech addressing this? We don't say, well, what's the mayor of my town going to do? We don't say, what's the governor of my state going to do? We don't care, because in our lives, they are vastly less important than what the president does and says, right? And it wasn't always that way. Prior to the Great Depression, the president was some guy that lived in a White House halfway across the country, probably, okay? In your day-to-day life, the president had very little influence. The president had had nothing to do with you, really. I think I've mentioned before, most people's only engagement with the federal government was when they went to the post office to mail something. That was it. Prior to Social Security, prior to unemployment benefits, prior to the interstate highways, prior to all of this stuff, the federal government had such a small part in your daily life that people ignored it. After the Great Depression, that is no longer the case. The federal government is now huge. It's larger than it's ever been. We've got all these new regulatory agencies that have a very direct impact on your day-to-day life. And you've got the president as the face of it all. What is he going to do? What is the American president going to do to get us out of this crisis? So that cannot be overstated, that he is now the face of the American government. The federal government is involved in all aspects of your life, whether it's building federal roads or ensuring your cars are safe to drive on those federal roads, or providing tax subsidies to give you gas to go on those federal roads. Everything has to do with the federal government these days, and that really all goes back to the 1930s and the New Deal. All right.